All right, well, this session we are talking about the question of science, really, and how this interrelates with faith. The question I have on the screen is, hasn't science disproved God? Again, we'll talk some about that. We're going to expand it beyond that as well as we go through this. And so we'll talk about a variety of different things. Let me just confess at the outset, I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be one. I'm not going to get deep into technical things because I can't. And I don't want to present myself as something that I'm not. This might make our Q&A session a little bit interesting if you ask questions that I just don't have the expertise to answer fairly, and I want to be honest about that fact. So how on earth am I going to deal with this question if I have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Well, a couple things. One is that it's not something I have no idea about, but part of this question is not a scientific question, it's a philosophical question. Because this is largely a philosophical issue, not a scientific issue. But what we are going to be doing some of as well is talking about a variety of perspectives of science that have to be answered one way or another. And I'm going to share with you on a variety of topics quotes from non-believing scientists as just a reflection of the acknowledgement of the truth of what is there. And so I'll show you more quotes than I'll ever show you in my life today. And there's going to be more words on the screen than I ever put on the screen because these are the experts. And with two exceptions, they're all non-believing. One is a believer, or he's passed now, but he was a believer, and he kind of expands on what the scientific quote is saying to kind of flesh it out a little bit more. And so I'll share with you that quote. And one is from someone who was raised Catholic and I don't believe practices and has said things that make me think he's pretty much an atheist now, but just in the interest of full disclosure, he was at some point some kind of believer, I presume, or at least he was raised that way. So everyone else is just an outright atheist, and this is their perspective on a variety of different sorts of things. And again, I don't think there's going to be any debate at the end of the list of things we have to explain what is there one way or another. So I don't think I'm speaking beyond my ability. However, you may ask questions that are beyond my ability, and I'll just acknowledge that at the outset. So, hasn't science disproved God? This is our question. And I would say, first of all, and this is not a point I'm going to spend a lot of time on because it's not an incredibly valuable point, but I want to say this because it's important to at least put it out there, that there's no scientific consensus to this effect, that science has disproved God. If science had conclusively disproved God, you would expect every scientist who exists to believe that because they're scientists. And they embrace science, and they do the work of science. And if science had disproved God, they would buy into that. However, it's interesting, science rose out of theism. You go back to some of the earliest big-name scientists, they're coming out of theistic perspectives. And they're coming out of that, and they're doing science because they believe that there's order to the universe. And they believe there's regularity to the universe because they believe that there was a God who created the universe with regularity and order rather than chaos and happenstance. And so they thought we should be able to find in studying the sciences evidence of that and be able to understand it because there's regularity and order to it. There's never been a time where all scientists were atheists, including at the height of the Enlightenment and rationalism periods. A couple months ago, I looked just to see, and I went to Wikipedia, top-end research source here. Wikipedia's list of Christians in science and technology page, and it took me 15 clicks to get to the bottom of it, kind of scrolling page by page by page, not the little arrow at the bottom. 15 clicks to get to the bottom. And that is not an exhaustive list of all Christian scientists, because I know several Christian scientists who aren't on that list. It's certainly not including Jews or Muslims or polytheists or deists, who also we would disagree with their view of God, but they don't believe that there's not a God. And there are several of them in the sciences as well. And so the point here isn't that, here's a list of Christians who believe in, or scientists who believe in theism, therefore theism's right. No, that can't be made to say that. There's not a lot of value here. You can't prove something by accumulating a list of names of people who believe it. That's just not good argumentation. But it's worth mentioning because, again, there's just not consensus to this. But at the same time, even if everyone agreed, that's still not proof one way or the other, because compiling names is not the same thing as evidence. Everyone can agree and be wrong at the same time. That's just a possibility. So my point is basically that there's not universal consensus, which you would expect there to be if science had conclusively disproven God. More importantly than that is the fact that it is impossible for science to disprove God. It just can't be done, in part because of the limitations of the scientific method. The scientific method employs what is called methodological naturalism in order to accomplish its studies. Methodological naturalism, that's a mouthful, right? What that means is it uses the method of studying natural things by natural means. It adds natural variables to see natural results. It deals entirely within the realm of nature. And that's perfectly reasonable, right? You don't expect the scientist to involve the supernatural in the lab. It can't be done. So it's a limitation of the scientific method is that it has to deal with naturalism and natural things, but by definition, whether you believe in Him or not, God is supernatural. So this is just a realm of inquiry that is outside of what science can even talk about. To talk about God is to leave naturalism and to leave science and enter into the realm of philosophy. It's to leave physics and enter into the realm of metaphysics. The scientific method, methodological naturalism, they are useful tools. They can accomplish incredible things. I don't think Christians should stand around bashing science. It's just not intelligent in any sort of way. At the same time, however, we have to understand, and I think scientists should understand, the limitations of methodological naturalism. It's a valuable tool, but it must be used in its context. It's like a chainsaw. It's a valuable tool if you're using it the right way. Got to cut down a tree? It's fantastic. Need to cut a bite of your steak? Not so good for that. Worse for performing surgery. I mean, there are tools that are great for their purpose that are terrible for other purposes. And methodological naturalism is one of those things. It is a great, great tool for scientific inquiries into nature, but it simply cannot address the topic of God. That's just outside the realm of what this can do. On top of that, I'd say that there are limitations to human ability. That there is no way within our abilities as people to prove that God exists or to prove that God doesn't exist. We talked about this a little bit earlier in our morning session, right? How do you disprove the existence of God? Well, aside from the silly illustrations I gave at that point, I think something else that's worth talking about is just the difficulty of proving a negative. To prove that something exists is really easy. You find one example of it existing and you've proven that it exists. To prove that something doesn't exist, even within the realm of nature, is incredibly, incredibly hard. Just because you found no examples of it doesn't mean that it's not there. Even in the narrowest of investigations, it can be hard. And really, it's only in the very narrowest of investigations that you can have any hope of proving a negative, to disprove the existence of something. And I would say the same thing is true on the other side for proving the supernatural. You can't, it's really hard to disprove anything, to prove a negative, to prove that something doesn't exist. But from a Christian perspective, I think it's worth noting, and I think it's important to realize that conclusively proving the existence of God is also next to impossible. The limitations of the scientific method of disproving Him apply to proving Him as well. You can't methodologically, by naturalism, prove the existence of God. You just can't. What lab are you going to do that investigation in? How are you going to add variables to prove God's existence? And beyond that, as the Bible, I think, makes pretty clear, God is interested in people of faith, not people of knowledge. And so there are things that He has kept a mystery. And so that's part of the Christian life in general. And as we talked about earlier, I think it was in a Q&A, that seeing God has never solved faith problems anyway. And so there's no point in him just revealing himself as the way we sometimes think that would solve all of our problems. But at the same time, as we've said, God doesn't want blind faith. God wants rational, reasoned faith, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. And so it's just very difficult to disprove God. It takes us out of the realm of science and into the realm of philosophy, which brings me to our last point here, which is that this is not what scientists do well. And some of them do. Some of them can, just like people who are philosophers can talk intelligently about science. I mean, you can cross fields. I think we need to get away from the intellectual snobbery idea that if you don't have a degree in something, you can't talk intelligently about it. That's just not true. But I would also say at this point that scientists are scientists. Most of them are not philosophers. And the question of God's existence is a philosophical inquiry, not a scientific one. And at some point, there does come a place to say, we really should stick to what we know well. How many of you know the name Richard Dawkins? A few of you? Oh, most of you. Okay. Richard Dawkins is a very, very big name British biologist. Very intelligent man. Wrote a book called The God Delusion. Is probably one of his biggest claims to fame. He's not an atheist. He's an anti-theist. I mean, he is technically an atheist, obviously, but he is on a warpath against religion. And that's kind of how he's made his name, among other things. Highly educated, well-credentialed, brilliant biologist, wrote this book, The God Delusion, arguing against God's existence. Let me tell you about someone else who is highly educated and well-credentialed, who is an apologist and theologian. We'll call him Nathan Ward. How do you think Dawkins would feel if I wrote a book called Why Everything Your Biology Teacher Taught You Is Wrong? He would look at me and say, you have no business writing that book. You're way out of your field and you're way out of your league. You don't know what you're talking about. And I would say, you know what, he's right. To which I say, pot, meet, kettle, right? I've read Dawkins. Dawkins is not a philosopher, and he's certainly not a theologian. When he starts talking about why you shouldn't believe in God because of Old Testament issues, he has no concept of theology. He can't begin to wrap his mind around what those texts are actually about. He's out of his league. Now, that's not to say that he shouldn't ever be allowed to say anything about it, that he can't be involved in the discussion, but you would hope that he'd have the humility to realize, I'm out of my field here. And when scientists step out of their field of expertise to write something that they dabble in at best, don't presume that their scientific credentials follow them into theology. They don't. They might know what they're talking about, they might be intelligent enough to figure it out, or they might just be looking for something to, say evil things about God about there. And the multiplicity of philosophical blunders in Dawkins' religious writing really just, I think makes that point pretty clear in terms of where he's coming from. Now, he's just one example. But I do think it's important to say, just because a scientist says something about religion or the Bible doesn't mean they know what they're talking about because they're a scientist. Likewise, just because a preacher says something about science doesn't mean that he knows what he's talking about either. And again, that's part of why I'm going to be telling you what non-believing scientists say about some of the issues we'll talk about today. So let's talk about some of these issues that come up in scientific inquiry, talk about some of the things that are there and where they come from. And I think this will be profitable. I hope this will be profitable for you as we think about this topic. So let's start with, something small. The existence of the universe and everything that is in it. Where did that come from? For a very long time, the universe was thought to be eternal. And no scientist objected to that. In fact, there are some scientists that are still trying to come up with a way of the universe being eternal in spite of what the broad scientific consensus is. And so multiverse theories are ways of dealing with that. Some sort of repeated Big Bang where the universe expands and collapses and all of that. That's a way of dealing with that. But in that view, matter and energy are eternal. They've existed forever. They will continue to exist forever, and that's that view. But that's really the minority view these days in science. The view now is that the universe had a starting point. This begins all the way back in the days of Hubble and his work in astronomy and seeing the universe is expanding. And if the universe is expanding, that means if you wind the clock backwards, it's shrinking. And it shrinks and it shrinks and it shrinks, and eventually there's a stopping point in shrinking. There may not be a stopping point in expanding, but there's got to be a stopping point in shrinking. And so that's where the idea of the Big Bang came from. There was this explosion into existence of everything that exists, which is a really interesting idea. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't, but it's a really interesting idea. And with the Big Bang theory, suddenly came the idea that the universe had a starting point. And the broad scientific consensus is the universe had a starting point. And that raises some interesting questions, because if the universe had a starting point, what started the universe? Is kind of the question that naturally flows out of that. Let me show you a quote from an astronomer named Robert Jastrow, who wrote, he was an agnostic, he was writing in the 70s and 80s, is really all of this was beginning to get more and more popular. And he's talking about the fact that they have discovered the universe had a beginning point. And he begins by talking about wishing he could look further into that. He says, now, we would like to pursue that inquiry farther back in time, but the barrier to further progress seems insurmountable. It's not a matter of another year, another decade of work, another measurement, or another theory. At this moment, it seems as though science will never be able to raise the curtain on the mystery of creation. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. This is brilliantly written there, isn't it? What Jastrow says is science has progressed and science has progressed and science has progressed, and we finally come to realize the universe has a beginning point. Meanwhile, all the Judeo-Christians have been sitting around going, yeah, we've been saying that for centuries now. Welcome to the party. The universe has a beginning point. And this is, again, the broad consensus these days. The universe has a beginning point. But what's really interesting is that this is a piece of an important philosophical argument for the existence of God. It's one that some people find very compelling and one that some people don't find very compelling at all. And so I don't know where you'll fall on that, so take it as you take it, but it's called the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument goes like this. There's 3 points to it. First of all, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now notice that's not everything that exists has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, is the first premise. Secondly, the universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. So that's the cosmological argument. It's really easy to remember your mnemonic device there. It's the argument from first cause is the cosmological argument. It's not spelled the same, but it works as a mnemonic device. So the cosmological argument, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. What's fascinating, this argument's been around since like Thomas Aquinas and even earlier than that in various forms, but the argument existed with the presumption that the universe was actually eternal. That's what had to be proven. Back then, no one ever argued that everything that begins to exist has a cause. No one ever argued against that. That's common sense, right? When was the last time you saw something happen and presumed that it didn't have a cause? Something began, and you said, oh, that just happened on its own. We're sitting here in the building, and you hear a loud crash outside, and you say, what made that happen? I say, oh, nothing. You wouldn't believe me, right? So if there's a small bang outside, and that had to have a cause, how about a big bang? Maybe that needs a cause too, right? So that's kind of the way the argument goes there. Now, let me give you an illustration of that kind of common sense perspective of everything that begins has a cause. One day we were in my living room when my elder son was probably 2 or so, and he was running around doing things, and I had a beach ball in my hand, and being the good father that I am, I pegged him with a beach ball when he wasn't looking. And he turned around and said, "Who did that?" You see, there's common sense right there. A 2-year-old knows that that didn't just happen on its own. Something made that beach ball fly across the room and hit him in the back of the head. It's just a beach ball, it's okay. That's how everyone has always viewed everything, at least until science came to the consensus that the universe had a beginning point. Now, all of a sudden, you have scientists saying, "Oh, no, everything that begins to exist doesn't have to have a cause." And the great question, well, what caused God then? Well, yeah, I said everything that begins to exist. If we're okay with a transcendent universe that exists forever, and there's no philosophical roadblock to matter and energy existing forever eternally, why is there suddenly a giant problem with a being existing eternally? If eternal can be eternal, whatever it is, if you're okay with something being eternal, you can be okay with something being eternal. And so God doesn't have to begin any more than matter or energy had to begin in that previous way of looking at things. And so it's an interesting thing to watch the debate shift, because for years, theistic philosophers were just thinking, man, if we just could prove the universe had a beginning, we have this nail in the coffin argument for the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Suddenly, astronomy dropped into our lap the beginning point of the universe. And you've got a couple of options. Either you say everything that begins to exist doesn't have to have a cause, or you come up with alternate theories of how the universe didn't begin to exist, all of which, by the way, have no basis in hard science. Scientifically prove to me a multiverse. It's an interesting theory. It's beyond the realm of science. It's out there with God and philosophy and thinking and metaphysics and worldviews. All right, let's talk about another easy question. The origin of life. Where does life come from? Well, this is one of those interesting things as well, because, without a designer, without someone who has created life, for it to happen naturalistically on its own is an incredibly difficult process. I won't get into the details of this because I know it would bore you to tears, but the difficulty of forming a single protein molecule is itself inordinately difficult. You've got to take a bunch of amino acids and combine them, and not all amino acids work well with one another, and you have to have the right kind of chemical bond. They don't all work, and there's got to be a long string of them. They interact with other things better than they interact with one another when left to their own devices. Somehow you've got to create this long string of them just to get one protein molecule. Then you need another 100 or so to create the very first living cell. In fact, Frederick Hoyle described this process as saying it would be like a tornado whirling through a junkyard and assembling a fully functional Boeing 747. Well, to be fair, that's more rhetorically potent than it is scientifically precise or philosophically sound, but his exaggeration does bring out the difficulty. How do you form life without design? How do you form life without something putting life into it? Just a bunch of natural stuff left to its own devices. There have been a variety of theories that have been posed. There was an experiment done back in the 1950s by Stanley Miller as one of the chief people in that experiment, where they tried to recreate the early environment of Earth and shoot electricity through it to see if they could make some amino acids. And they did that as long as they stacked the deck in favor of the kind of atmosphere that they thought the Earth had to have in order for it to work. And so if you create the environment, and if you create the electric, then you can create some amino acids, therefore we've disproven creation. You see the problem there? We create. There's a whole lot of design in that. Now, to be fair, that's the only way you can do that kind of experiment. They can't just like close the lab door and wait 10 billion years and see if life comes up at the end of it. So you got to be fair with what they're doing, but it is kind of at least an ironic thing that you have this very designed process to prove that there was no designer. That by itself is at least interesting to consider. But what's really fascinating is what Stanley Miller winds up saying by the end of this is that the problem of the origin of life has turned out to be much more difficult than I or most other people envisioned. You see, this is one of the biggest questions that non-believers have to deal with that they can't answer easily. They either have to take a step of faith and say, I believe that there is no God, or they have to be total agnostic and say, I don't know, I can't know there is, I can't know that there isn't, and that's just my decision I'm going to make. But the question of origins, the origin of the universe, the origin of life, are questions that cannot be scientifically answered, conclusively proven. It is just impossible to do so. Francis Crick, who is one of the co-discoverers of DNA, who is pretty strongly atheistic in his views, said, every time I write a paper on the origin of life, I swear I will never write another one because there is too much speculation running after too few facts. I can respect that quote all day long, because here's a man who's being honest. I don't know how it happened. I can guess, I can speculate, but there's not enough data to scientifically answer the question of the origin of life. Well, can't you look at how life works now and extrapolate from that? I mean, scientists do that all the time, right? There are things that scientists don't know, they can't investigate, and so they look at the regularities of life now and extrapolate from the data that they have to theorize about what it might have been like when they couldn't test it, right? That kind of thing happens pretty frequently, pretty consistently. So what is there now? Well, now, man, there is biological information. Right now, what we have that makes life really easy so that we just hum right through it without thinking about it is this little thing called DNA. DNA contains within it all of the information that every cell needs to do everything that cell is supposed to do properly. To restore the cell itself, to work in the way that it's supposed to work. Bill Gates, this is the one who was raised Catholic and seems pretty much like an atheist now, says DNA is like a software program, only one much more complex than anything we've ever devised. DNA works on a 4-letter chemical alphabet. That these 4 chemical letters, as they're called, have to be arranged in the right way to perform the right function, to relay the right information to the right part of the cell to do the right thing. It's a really, really remarkable process how DNA works. And again, it's beyond my understanding completely, but it's fascinating to look at what DNA does and how DNA does it. But how telling is this quote? DNA is like a software program, only something far greater than anything we've ever come up with. All right, Mr. Gates, how many naturalistic phenomena do you employ to write software? Need some software, so we'll hire the wind and some erosion, a little bit of rain, and that will write software for us, right? Give it enough time. You've heard the infinite monkeys on infinite typewriters, you know. Eventually it's going to happen on its own. Have you ever seen information come about that way? What do you presume every time you've ever seen information in your life? You're driving along the road one day, and you come into a town, and there on the side of the hill, in the bushes, the way they're configured, it says, "Welcome to Springfield." And you say, man, that's incredible. Those bushes just so happened to grow up in such a way that it spells welcome to the very town I'm driving into. That's amazing how that just happened on its own, right? No, you presume someone planted them in that shape and have groomed them over the years to look nice and neat. You go along, you're walking through the city square, and here's a bush that looks like an elephant, and here's one that looks like a giraffe, there's one that looks like a dolphin. It's amazing how these bushes have just grown up to look like these animals. No, you presume someone has carved them down, trimmed them down, pruned them down, whatever the right word I should use there is, to look like that thing. And we don't typically think of the shape of an elephant as information, but it is. It's a kind of information. And just because it's unique doesn't mean that it's information. You look at one rock side on the side of a cliff, and it's just random and, 1 in a billion chances that it would look like that. You look at this other one, and it's got the faces of 4 presidents on it. Random 1 in a billion chances it would look like that. One of them is information and one's not, right? I can't believe this guy spent all this time carving that random nonsense. But man, look at those presidents. Funny how that just happened on its own, right? You're going through a cave and you see some paintings on the wall. And on the wall you see the people and they're hungry. And then you see them going out for the hunt. And you see the scene of the kill and the celebration that follows. And you think, wow, the water stains and the way they've just dripped into the wall and drawn these pictures. It's an amazing thing how that just happened on its own. The point that I'm making in all of this, in these analogies, as ridiculous as they might be, is that every single time that you have ever seen information, you have presumed, and rightly so, that there is an intelligence behind the information. You've never once seen information and presumed that it happened all on its own somehow. There was a book that was written and a movie that followed it by Carl Sagan called Contact. Have you seen Contact? That's old time now at this point. Well, Contact is about contact from outer space. There is, in this book, a series of prime numbers that get sent to the Earth from outer space. And what happens is everyone presumes there are people out there trying to contact us, because a series of prime numbers is not just going to happen on its own. There must be intelligence behind it. Carl Sagan, by the way, is a pretty devout atheist. He was. I think he's passed on at this point now. But he did not believe, and yet he understood something as simple as a series of prime numbers points to intelligence. If a series of prime numbers points to intelligence, why does not something that is more complex than any computer program that's ever been written not point to intelligence? One strand of DNA has in it more information than the entire Encyclopedia Britannica put together. Why does that not point to intelligence? How does the most complex bit of information that is known to exist come into being without intelligence? That question has to be answered somehow. Which brings us to the idea of design, or at least what we're going to call for our purposes the appearance of design. Because not everyone will agree that design is there. But everyone does agree that at least it looks designed. And especially at the molecular level, man, things really look designed at that point. So Richard Dawkins, obviously an atheist here, says biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So he says, right at the outset, things look like they have been designed. He goes on to say, we may say that a living body or organ is well designed if it has the attributes that an intelligent and knowledgeable engineer might have built into it in order to achieve some sensible purpose. Any engineer can recognize an object that has been designed, even poorly designed for a purpose, and he can usually work out what that purpose is just by looking at the structure of the object. And he's going on to say, you can figure out what different things do in the biological world by what they look like. But notice what he's almost giving away in all of this. You see a hammer, you can figure out what it's for, right? And so you presume that it just naturally happened somehow. Or do you presume that someone put the hammer there? You can figure out what the purpose is. You can recognize design. Yet all he is willing to talk about is the appearance of design. Because if it's actually designed, then there's got to be a designer, right? Crick, who was the co-discoverer of DNA I mentioned a minute ago, says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Talk about another telling kind of quote. Why do biologists have to constantly remind themselves of this? Because what they see is telling a different story. You keep telling yourself that what you see isn't what it looks like it is. That's what Crick says biologists have to constantly be doing. There's a molecular biologist named Michael Behe who is an intelligent design believer. He's one of the first people on the kind of cutting edge of that when it started back in the late 90s, who talks about life at the molecular level. And he talks about things like the bacterial flagellum and the intricate way that tiny thing is put together. And it's like a motor is what it looks like. And in fact, the terms the scientists have given to the parts of the bacterial flagellum that make it work are the exact same terms that actual motors use to describe those same parts. And it's because they serve the same function. If you ever look at a picture of one, you can pull one up, not right now, you can pull one up on your phone and look up a bacterial flagellum, and it's amazing what it looks like. And to think that it just happened randomly on its own somehow is just it's a difficult pill to swallow. Behe talks about what he calls irreducible complexity. If you've done much reading in intelligent design, you've come across this before. Irreducible complexity talks about something that requires all of the parts in order to work. And if you take away any one of those parts, it no longer works. And this is significant because Darwinian evolution says that if something doesn't work, it doesn't survive to the next generation. It gets weeded out by natural selection. And so if you have something that is irreducibly complex, that is to say, you have to have all the parts in order for it to work, you find that in nature, then you've got a problem with Darwinian evolution. And Darwin acknowledged that as well. I don't have the quote here, but Darwin basically says, if you can find something in nature that cannot have been achieved by successive, slow, slight modifications, then my theory absolutely falls apart. That's not an exact quote, but that's pretty close to it. And so what Behe is doing is trying to find things in nature that are what he calls irreducibly complex. It needs all the parts in order for it to work. Just to illustrate that so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about with all of the parts in order for it to work. The illustration that Behe gives is that of a mouse trap. Because it's a very simple mechanism, right? You only got a few parts. You've got the wooden platform that everything's attached to. You've got the hammer that smashes the mouse. You've got the spring that makes the hammer work. You've got the little catch where you put the bait in order for it to spring the trap. You've got the holding bar that keeps the hammer in place until it springs shut. You start to think about it, and what do you have if you take away any one of those parts? Something that doesn't, junk. Something that doesn't work anymore at all. No spring, hammer doesn't slam. No hammer, mouse won't die. No place to put the bait, nothing to set off the trap. No platform, you got jingling metal and nothing else. The one thing that could possibly work without is the holding bar to keep the hammer back, but the only way that would work is if you hold it back with your finger and chase the mouse around the room and trap it in a corner and then let it go. So, I guess it could work in some other way, but you have to have all the parts in order for this to work. If you can find something biologically that needs all of the parts to work, it cannot have arisen by Darwinian evolution, according to Darwin's own terms. Now, Behe has produced in his writing several examples of things he thinks that is the case of. There is, of course, scientific disagreement about that. And so people have said, no, that's not the case, and he has written back, and there's been back and forth over the last 25 years on this topic, and I don't even intend to set about to discuss that or answer that today. But understand, that's a really powerful argument that comes from Darwin himself, and people are actively, constantly looking into that sort of perspective. So that's the appearance of design. Something else that we have to need to, it's getting late, isn't it? That we need to talk about is the fine-tuning of physical law. This is sometimes called the anthropic principle or the anthropic principle, depending on who you're asking. What this has to do with is the fine-tuning of physical laws to support life. I'm not going to take the time to give you a long list of examples. You can find this very easily. Basically, what it amounts to are the laws of physics, and so many of them, if they're changed by the slightest degree, we would all die. You know, what the gravitational rate is. If it was changed slightly, we would die. What the boiling point of water is. If it was changed slightly, we would die. It's incredible. The oxygen level on the planet, we would all die. It's one after another example of this happening. So Stephen Hawking says the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. It's a remarkable thing. The laws of physics just so happen to support human life. And if you change them in even the slightest amount, human life is no longer possible. And someone as brilliant as Hawking acknowledges this. Frederick Hoyle says, and this is pretty remarkable. Let me say this. Fred Hoyle was kind of a maverick in science. He's not well liked by all scientists because he would just say whatever. And he didn't care what the implications were. So this is the sort of thing that scientists would take issue with, but he's a non-believing scientist that said it. So I'll at least tell you what he said. He says, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. Wow, that's pretty potent thing to say, right? As well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seems to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question, and yet he still never became a believer. Yet look at what he says. Hoyle said nothing shook his atheism the way the fine-tuning of physical laws did. A super intellect monkeyed with physics is what it looks like to him. It's a pretty remarkable thing to see. How does that happen? Did it just randomly happen? Did it just accidentally happen? It has to be answered somehow or completely ignored. Those are your options all the way down. Let's talk about consciousness, human consciousness. Where does this come from? Let me talk about this from two different perspectives. The second one being the one I'm really more interested in for our purposes, but the first one is interesting as well, and that is the issue of human intellect, that kind of consciousness. Charles Darwin said, "Within me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." If evolution is true, why should I trust what I think? Any more than I trust what that monkey over there thinks or that dog over there thinks. If all we are is an evolved animal, can I even trust my intellect? This is the one where C.S. Lewis, who is our chief proponent of not being an atheist in our quotes today, elaborated on this idea. Lewis said, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind, in that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore I have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. Now, obviously, this is not something everyone would agree with, and there's certainly room to think about this idea, but I think there's something to be said here, is that at least the idea of there being a God and giving you the capability of thought means you can trust what you think consistently. Whereas if it just happened on its own, if we're just evolved animals, or if it just happens to be that our atoms inside our skull are happening to be in a certain way, what is there reason to trust in that at all? So human intellect, human thought itself is an interesting thing to wrestle with where it came from. But as we talk about consciousness itself, one of the fascinating things to me is that when you talk about consciousness and you read about consciousness, there are a variety of atheistic philosophers who have come to the conclusion that there is an immaterial consciousness within the human being. That is something that is separate from brain activity. That brain activity is one thing and consciousness is something else. There is the brain and there is the mind. The brain, or what the Christian might say, is the soul in the person. So Colin McGinn, who's an atheist, says, how can mere matter originate consciousness? How did evolution convert the water of biological tissue into the wine of consciousness? Consciousness seems like a radical novelty in the universe, not prefigured by the after effects of the Big Bang. So how did it contrive to spring into being from what preceded it? Where did consciousness come from? Especially if it's something separate from brain activity. If it's just brain activity, then maybe there's no question to be asked here. But obviously theologians would say it's something different, but even growing numbers of atheists have come to the conclusion that there's something more to consciousness than all of this. Jeff Madell, another philosopher, says the emergence of consciousness then is a mystery and one to which naturalism fails to provide an answer. And there are plenty of people that are talking about consciousness in these terms these days. I've read that there are even atheistic neuroscientists who are making this perspective. I've not been able to find any quotes from any of them. So I'll tell you that I've read that they're there, but I've not been able to get anything to show you what they have said. That would be pretty powerful if you've got neuroscientists saying, who are unbelievers, saying there is immaterial consciousness separate from brain activity. Where on earth does something immaterial come from? But beyond that, just human consciousness being different from animal consciousness. I mean, the ability that we have to introspect, the ability that we have to think abstractly about things. The way the human mind works is far different from the way that the mind of any animal works. How does that evolve? Where does that come from is the question. So what we've talked about are a variety of things that exist, and I'm a little bit short on this session, and that's fine. Maybe we'll have time for more discussion. Maybe we can start the last session early and call it a day. But what I want to end with is kind of summing up all of this that we've talked about in a single place, and then show you one last quote that I think is maybe the most telling of all. But what I'm going to show you, let me show you first here. This is my list of everything that we've talked about, these things that exist, these things that I don't think are debatable one way or the other. They are there, and we'll offer a couple of suggestions. So, obviously everything that exists. It's there. Life exists. Information within the cell exists. The appearance of design exists. An ordered universe exists. And human consciousness exists. That's all there. No argument from anybody. I can't imagine even the most ardent atheist saying, no, life does not exist. All of this is there. You have to explain it somehow. That's the question, is how do you explain it? Let me share with you two theories. One of these theories is hard science that is rooted in intelligence and reality, that is not affected by silly superstitious ideas like religion. And the other theory is blind faith. It's a virtual fairy tale of absurdity and anti-intellectualism and pseudoscience. You can guess which one is which. One view says nothing produced everything. It says non-life produced life. It says non-intelligence produced information. It says chaos brought about the appearance of design. It says coincidence produced an ordered universe. And it says non-consciousness begat consciousness. The other view says that something produced everything. It says that life produced life. It says that intelligence produced information. It says a designer produced the appearance of design. It says a designer produced an ordered universe. An architect produced an ordered universe. And it says an eternal consciousness produced human consciousness. One of these is a silly fairy tale. One of these is intellectually satisfying. Let me suggest to you that if we were talking about anything other than the existence of God, everybody in the world would say column A is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And column C makes sense. Really? Nothing produced everything? Non-life produced life, non-intelligence produced information, chaos brought about design, coincidence produced an ordered universe, and non-consciousness created consciousness? That's the best scientific explanation. That's the one that's free from the silliness of religion. That's hard science. That's rooted in intelligence and reality. And the other one's a fairy tale? Really? That's what we're supposed to believe? Richard Lewontin, who is an atheistic zoologist at Harvard, says this. He says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Materialism there is naturalism. The material world is all that there is. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts to produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Again, I may disagree, but I can at least respect this. Because here's a man who's being honest. Here's a man who says, why do scientists believe some of the things that scientists believe? Because we decided at the outset that's how it has to be. And when I decided at the outset that materialism, that naturalism, that the natural world is all that there is and there can't be anything else at all whatsoever, well, lo and behold, that's the conclusion I come to at the end of the day. And I believe things like non-life produced life and so forth and so on. It seems, as he says, counterintuitive. It seems like an unsubstantiated just so story. And it's mystifying, he says, to the uninitiated. Those people who aren't the scientists, those people who don't get it. How can you possibly believe that? Well, you're not a scientist. That's why you don't get it. You don't have the same pre-commitment that I do. It's a reminder that, as I've said already today, everybody is biased. Everybody has presuppositions. Everybody walks into something with a belief that they already have. And the only question is whether we're honest enough to admit it to ourselves, and whether we're honest enough to deal with the information fairly. At least Lewontin is honest enough to acknowledge that this is where he's coming from and why he comes to the conclusions that he comes to. All right, like I said, I'm done quickly this time. I didn't elaborate enough on some things, I suppose. We'll try some Q&A. We'll see how that goes with me not being a scientist. If there are any note cards to collect, or we can do some hand raising again. If not, and we'll see how this goes before I say anything. Yeah.
I like evolution.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you about that. What are your opinions on it? And then that'll lead me to another question.
On evolution, can you narrow that a little bit, or is it just broadly?
Just broadly. Obviously, you don't think we came from and all that stuff, but just do you think things have evolved from other things?
I think that there is a distinction that is important that most evolutionists don't like to make, and that is evolution within a species and evolution from one species into another species. It's frequently called microevolution versus macroevolution. And my experience, at least, is that most evolutionists would rather just talk about evolution and presume it's all the same thing. I don't believe it's the same thing myself. I believe microevolution, evolution within a species, is demonstrable, it has happened, and it's undeniable. I mean, the fact that, you can walk around town and see, 50 different people that all look very different from each other is, I think, pretty good evidence that that happens, because whether you believe life came from some random cells that started somehow, or you believe life came from God and Adam and Eve or something else, there's a single origin of life, and yet all these people look so different. So microevolution, I think, is undeniable. The question is, does that mean that something can evolve so much that it is no longer that species and it's become another species? And there is, to my knowledge, no scientific evidence that ever happened. That's an extrapolation from one set of data. I personally don't think that there's good evidence for it, and my worldview is different from that, and so obviously I'm not buying into that kind of evolutionary theory.
Okay, and then I got another question from that. So this is, it has to do with microevolution, but we said we've seen it firsthand, and we've seen it with viruses like the HIV virus. We've seen it with that. So just how can we know that if we can watch evolution firsthand in something like that, then how can we know that maybe something back there along the lines of the billions of years that the Earth has potentially been around,
Sure.
that didn't happen at some point or another to create
Something else. Yeah. Well, I don't know that you can conclusively not know that that happened. But again, at this point, we're moving out of science and into faith. What the HIV virus mutations and evolutions have not done, they've not turned into influenza. And of course, maybe it needs billions of years for that to happen. But again, we're extrapolating, we're looking at data and extrapolating, we're taking a step of faith to say this, here's the solution, is that based on this information, I think this other thing happened. And this is my theory of, not my theory of evolution, my view on evolution is that it's a faith system too. And to be someone who is convinced of evolution is to take a step of faith in a different direction than to say you're convinced in God creating everything, which is a step of faith in the opposite direction. Is there more? Yeah.
Can I piggyback off that, please?
Yeah.
You had that view of microevolution might have happened. How many small changes would it take for you to convince that it's macro?
Yeah. How much does something have to change until it's not that thing anymore? Or not that species anymore, however the terminology you want to use. You've got breeds of dogs, for example. At what stage of microevolutionary change is it no longer recognizable as a dog and it's some other species instead? Is that a fair way of talking about your question?
I'm aware of at least the salamander species that a small separation in location, they can't breed anymore. But they still got salamanders, so that's the point.
Okay.
But they can no longer breed anymore. Are they still the same species?
Yeah, that's now we're getting beyond my credentials. And I don't know. I mean, more stepping it back, more I guess philosophically and abstractly. How many steps does it take before it's moved to macroevolution? I don't know how I would even begin to quantify that. That's an interesting question to think about. I'll give that some thought because I've never really quite thought in those terms before. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like your species, the way you classify. You say, microevolution is within a species, macro is outside. I've seen a lot of different scenarios where species evolution occurs, like with pheasants. For instance, pheasants that tend to fly get either eaten or shot,
Mhm.
and so then you have a species of pheasants that are more the runners, and they
Right.
do less flying. Or even a good example is a hog. If it's released into the wild, it changes. It actually evolves more with a longer tusk, coarser hair, and everything to evolve there. I just like that species, the classification you give. I've never seen it go create a new species per se.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't know that species is the right word there. Again, I'm not a zoologist, so kingdom, phylum, order, class, all of that. At some point, one of those levels is the right term to use, and I don't know for sure that species is the one, but I think we're all kind of, at least you understand what I'm getting at when I say that. So kind of colloquially, that's what I'm trying to say.
I have a couple other things, a couple questions.
One second, Gage, are you going to say something on this topic or?
That's all right. He can answer.
Okay, I just wanted to.
I was just gonna, it was on the topic.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just gonna say, like, I think something like when you read for instance, if you're reading the book of Genesis and I know you've got extensive work on the book of Genesis, but the Bible does talk about kinds,
Mhm.
right, of animals. So like that's possibly that's referring to like a group of animals on like a family level.
Mhm.
Not talking about specific species. And
Right.
that would allow for a wide range of variation.
Yeah.
Amongst different kinds of, like if you look at, for instance, let's go back to the dogs. If you look at dogs that live in Central Africa, short hair, fast, you got jackals, you got dingoes, you go up to
Yeah, so that's
all connected, basically by as being the same kind, they're still dogs.
right. And so that's where species probably wasn't the best word for me to use there in that particular description, but again, I'm not a zoologist.
Talking about pheasants, like you get, well, and that's the same with Darwin's finches.
Yeah.
Depending on what island they lived on in the Gulf Coast, they had a different type of meat that enabled them to better eat the types of food available on that island, but they're still finches.
Right. So you had more questions, you said?
Yeah, I was wanting to look at, has science been kind of adulterated by selective funding?
Oh, mercy, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, anything that's money driven, there's a possibility that it's been corrupted by the money. And that's not to throw science under the bus. That's anything and everything, whether it's science or politics or religion or whatever it may be. Once money is involved, it can be corrupted. It wouldn't surprise me, but I have no evidence to that, so I don't want to answer that definitively.
I wondered if there was a movement, if anybody's heard anything, movement to eliminate true scientists.
Oh, I just don't know. Yeah, Colton.
Okay. I'm trying to think of how to word this. So he brought up, like, at what step would it become macroevolution?
Yeah.
So just think like there's things that can breathe in water and out of water right now. So say if that happened and the fish came out of water, grew legs, and became whatever.
Something else, yeah.
Just, do you think that something like that could happen? Something like that did happen?
I would say something like that would be a really compelling piece of evidence that, what you have is this evolution from one kind to another kind, to use that language. But, what we see is things that breathe underwater, things that breathe both, things that breathe air. Is this middle one, is this our missing link, or is this, to use that language, or is this just a different kind of creature altogether that can do both, and it's not an evolutionary process, step in the process? I don't know. Do I believe it could happen? Theoretically, I don't know.
This is all just theoretically.
Yeah.
There's only so many things we can prove in our lifetime.
Right. And so, again, that's kind of brings me back to my perspective of whatever your worldview is, it's a worldview of faith. Unless you've just fundamentally said, I can't know anything about anything and I'm going to be a total agnostic, you're taking a step of faith in some direction. So let me look at these questions real quick that I've got on cards. So if we can make amino acids in a lab using chemicals on Earth, why couldn't the same thing happen in an enormous amount of time with the same chemicals? Two things I'd say there. One is kind of something that I said earlier on, is just kind of the built-in irony of, designing something to prove the lack of a designer, which is, again, as I said, to be fair, that's just what you have to do. But beyond that, I guess two things beyond that. One is the examples that were, the tests that were done, the Stanley Miller-Urey experiment in the 50s, they used an atmosphere that they presumed was the early Earth's atmosphere, in part because that's what was needed to make the experiment work. They presumed this is what happened, so they presumed this was the atmosphere. Since the 80s or 90s, NASA scientists have been saying that's not what the early Earth's atmosphere was like. Now, I don't know how they come to that conclusion. That's beyond my expertise. But my understanding is that the scientific consensus is that the atmosphere that Miller used in his experiment is not the early Earth's atmosphere. And so it won't work with those other chemicals that they say are in the atmosphere, or were in the atmosphere. And beyond that, why couldn't it have happened with just an enormous amount of time? I guess, theoretically, maybe it could. But my experience, at least, is that more time does not create more order. More time creates more disorder. You leave something to its own devices for a while, and it doesn't tend to just get better and better and better. It deteriorates and deteriorates and deteriorates. And so let's throw these random amino acids in a pool and leave them for 5 billion years. Are they going to come together and form life, or is entropy going to take over? Well, obviously I can't say for sure, but experientially at least, what I've seen is the opposite happens, not that it creates order. Time tends to create disorder. But again, I can't prove that one way or the other. If the conditions are different, is it conceivable that another type of life, another type of molecule or something could be formed? Again, I'm speaking outside my expertise, so I don't want to say too much, but theoretically conceivable, maybe. Would it have definitely happened? Is that a better explanation of the evidence? That's another question here as well, is, what could have theoretically happened is interesting. What is the evidence that we have, and what's the best explanation of the evidence is a different issue altogether. And again, when I look at what there is, and the naturalistic explanation and the theistic explanation, and again, not to create a false dichotomy because there are other views out there, but just looking at those two, naturalism is intellectually unfulfilling to me, at least. So the point about fine-tuning, this is suggesting, and you know what, this is a really good point, and I meant to clarify this as I was talking, and I just let the terminology slip past me. This is suggesting that life as we know it would not exist. Isn't that making the assumption that our kind of life was the goal, or perhaps the only kind of life that there could be? I typically, when I talk about this, I talk about life as we know it. And that is very much the case. Life as we know it could not exist without the fine-tuning of physics as we have it. And again, that's what people like Stephen Hawking even acknowledge, that this is the case. Could there have possibly been another kind of life that could have lived in another set of physical circumstances? I suppose theoretically, if God created a different kind of life. Sorry, that's not fair. But could life have evolved under different circumstances? Again, maybe. I don't know how to answer that with certainty. But that is a good point. That entire perspective is based on life as we know life. And then the question of our intelligence. Why couldn't we trust our intelligence when we make decisions and we reason and it works? And that's a good point too. The fact that we reason and what we see is it working, that's the evidence that we can trust our intelligence. And yeah, that's right. And that's why I don't spend a whole lot of time on that. And I think I said that this is more compelling to some people than others. It's striking to me that Darwin himself said, man, I'm just haunted by the fact that, can I even trust what I think? And whether you buy that or not, I think there can be, pragmatism becomes a measuring stick. I can't trust what I think because I'm just an evolved animal. I can't trust what I think because if God didn't create, like C.S. Lewis said, if God didn't create me, how can I trust? Well, you know what? If I do this, and every time I do this, this happens, then yeah, there's a pragmatic evaluation for your thought that can be there. So that is a good thought as well. So thank you for that.